Okay, to keep recapping a little bit of our notes here, chapters 17 and 18 are going to be a little bit more of the poetic terminology and some other different components of poetry that we want to think about, particularly how it talks about in 17, which is playing with meter, the measure of a poem. So he starts us off with this poem up here from Christina Rossetti. We've looked at some of her pieces earlier on as well, and setting us up for basically what we've talked about the sonnet. And the sonnet is a 14-lined rhyme poem. And it's written with the same iambic meter, which we talked about earlier in chapters. Now, the iamb, that consists of two syllables, the second one, which is accented. So if you read aloud the line, remember me when I am gone away, you can notice that it can be read to emphasize the certain syllables, the ones that fall in the second, the fourth, the sixth, the eighth, and final syllables. So if you were to put them in bold-faced letters, this is how it would appear here with the exaggerations. Remember me when I am gone away. Okay, I know that sounds really weird to hear me read that out loud that way, but to look at it with a perspective in that way, when you're avoiding any confusion, it is important to keep in mind that the different syllables and words are emphasized different ways. So that's why sometimes we all read sentences in different ways, different perspectives. So sometimes different words sound accented and different words are emphasized than others. Here you can read it, without being overemphasized. Remember me when I am gone away. If you read 3 or 4 lines of Rossetti's poem, as Cowitt says, you'll see that a lot of the emphasis in general falls on the even number syllables. So that establishes a pattern that makes up the rhythmic structure. We've talked a little about that, the meter of the poem. If you read the poem very naturally as you can, you would only probably emphasize a couple syllables that you would, like if we were having conversation in ordinary speech. And you wouldn't hear the meter and you wouldn't hear the underlying iambic meter. As Colbert talks about, in a metrical poem, it's usually pretty easy to pick apart the meter, as even if you don't have a lot of experience, because even if you read a poem out loud, you can emphasize even syllables that you don't have to pronounce that many words sort of artificially or on purpose, kind of in that kind of way. An iambic foot consists of 2 syllables, the first being unaccented and the second accented. So we can say that most lines of the poem are made up of 5 iambic feet. There are a couple exceptions that Cowitt talks about here. You can pronounce into as 2 words or 1 word. However, where you're putting accent on 2. The second line of the poem takes accent on the 5th syllable. That cannot be said to be made up exclusively of iambic feet. So line 7 begins with 2 syllables that don't fall into the iambic foot. The word only normally takes emphasis in the first syllable. The word better begins the next to the second last line, takes accent on the first and not second. So it's not perfectly in that way, but you can see how important it is here, how extremely important it is to read these pieces out loud. So just continuing here, just so I could break up these notes a little bit more. There are some other terminologies that you want to remember. So obviously, a line with 5 metrical feet or 5 stressed syllables is written in pentameter, so we can call it then the combination of iambic pentameter. You can also note the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables by placing a brevet, little mark right here, over the unaccented syllables, and ictus right here, over the accented ones. So we'll practice a little bit more about this too. A lot of this is good to do by hand when you're reading. You can designate an iamb by the combination here, and a line of iambic pentameter would have 5 of those together, hence the pentameter. So if you looked at the poem's 4th line, this is how you would note it. When you can no more hold me by the hand, that's the meter of the line. It points up the iambic metrical pattern, and if one was to scan the line that way, like you'd speak in conversation, it would look differently, or if you emphasize it by certain words. Now that might look really complicated and crazy, but it's really not. It's almost just like a little code switching of the language here that you think about. So it's just good to note because they will be referencing and looking at some of these. Now, if you look at meter in ordinary language, you don't want to think that only metrical feet exist in poetry, because we're actually looking at the rhythms of our own language and how it's spoken. So a common reading of a sentence would view it as a series of 6 anapaests. If you don't understand what we've said, read this section again and again so you can hear and look at kind of that too. You can also look at metrical substitutions. Sometimes that good poets writing in meter vary their measures, so that's also something to kind of note, as well as caesuras. So caesuras are poets writing in strict meters, and they tend to vary their caesuras, the internal pauses that you take within the lines too. So you can see them where some of them are easy to hear and some of them are harder to hear, and looking in some of those as well too. So you're going to see a lot of I'll also tell you to pay close attention to punctuation as you're looking through and picking out these different meters and rhythms and pieces too. Other kind of terminology to keep in mind is octave and sestet. Sonnets are broken up in terms of their thematic movement into the first 8 lines, which are the octave, and then the final 6 are the sestet. So going back, you can have those hints and those clues there, turn, and also going back and looking. There's a couple different exercises here. I certainly never feel self-conscious with it because it's kind of something that you have to just practice doing and looking at syllables in the word. It seems so basic, yet sometimes so very much overlooked. So we'll have a couple exercises that can help us in recognizing these and recognizing meter and pattern that we're going to do this in next week as well. And to kind of go with those, when you're looking at limericks and double dactyls, so again with the fun word phrasing here, a lot of people know what a limerick is. You know, it's sort of very much like having a character to start off with and some sort of location, and then, you know, kind of that lighthearted story, funny, far-fetched, I think always of Alice in Wonderland kind of approach to it. But limericks are characterized by certain rhythmic and rhyme patterns. When you look at the rhyme scheme in a limerick, the first, second, and fifth lines rhyme with each other, and the second line rhymes with the third. So, you know, up here, a poor working stiff named Maguire, consigned to the Stygian fire, sent a fax to the devil. Are you on the level? This is not where I plan to retire. So you can see up here, Maguire, fire, retire, rhyme, devil, and level. So here's your rhyme scheme that comes up. You could look at the meter of limericks. They're made up of iambs and anapaests. That can be used interchangeably. So here you can mark up the entire poem and see how they look on here. You'll notice that 3 and 4, the lines here, 3 with the devil, 4 with level, have an extra unaccented syllable. That can be called hypermetric or hypercalextric foot. I know there's a lot of terminology, but we're not going to use all of these right now. And you can look at different configurations, which can be called the third paeonic. So here's a limerick that kind of exemplifies, and another one here. Limericks are fun. They're so fun to play with the words and have sort of little clever parts with them. So we might try a limerick or two this week to get us started. There's a couple different exercises. The other fun part is the double dactyl. So, as Cowett writes, there was a few decades ago, the American poet Anthony Heck and his friend Paul Pascal had a silly and challenging little verse that they called the double dactyl. Almost makes me think it's not a dinosaur. It's a form of poetry. And it was published, and a sample of the form, which a lot of major poets have begun to use, T.S. Eliot and some others, kind of go up here. So here, the poem, written by Anonymous, is a poem that pokes fun at sort of a character. T.S. Eliot often didn't love the fact that there were these crazy kind of limericky, gadgety type of poems. And even though he wrote, and one might say what would be a very kind of extreme experimental type of way, he still held himself as very high regard. So this poem said, Eliot Schmeliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot, says that the 20th century sucks. Minivercivi's frayed, psychopathology cloaked improprieties, top hat and tux. Oh my goodness. And another double dactyl. Torridy lordy, moral majority, scourge of debaucheries, priapic zoo, plague of all nympho and gynematics, endless, libinius hullabaloo. I can't even say half these. But basically the double dactyls made up of 2 quatrains of 4-line stanzas, and the first 3 lines are made up of 2 dactyls. Dactyl's one that contains an accented syllable followed by two accented, unaccented ones. So Higgly Piggledy, it sounds so funny to say, is another example. Obviously, it's like a nonsense phrase, but you can easily rhyme the phrase, the line, with the second when it comes after that, too. The second line has to be a proper name or a proper noun. And then to challenge that, the second line of the second stanza has to be made up of one single word. That means you have to find a 6-syllable word that's accented on the first and fourth syllables. And the final rule is that the last line of each stanza must rhyme. So that has a lot of rules to it. That is surely a puzzle to get into. I like this one as well. Hestimus Festimus, Felix Domesticus, Regalus Princes and Laziest Bums, partial to canned food and ultra magnanimous folks who have got those opposable thumbs. An ode to cats. So we might try doing some double dactyls. I think they're fun, but they're fun when you get into them. It might seem a little unnerving to get started with them kind of in that first place here. There is one exercise with it. We'll see how far we come, maybe this or next week to do. So again, these are just to give you a sense. Please do not feel like you have to write in all of these kind of areas. We're going to be breaking them up into a lot others.